Hey, it's Joe West from West Barn with
Mike Shimshack.
Today we have mastering engineer Dave McNair on. Welcome to the program, Dave.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Dave's been a mastering engineer for the past 30 years and worked in all genres, a lot of Grammy award-winning records, platinum, gold records, worked with artists like Bob Dylan, Dave Bowie, Bruce Springsteen, Stevie Ray Vaughan. The list goes on and on and on and on. He's worked out of such iconic studios as Master Disc New York City and Sterling Sound. And we really are lucky to have him today. Mike and I were talking, and we have not had, we're almost at 100 episodes, we have not had a mastering engineer on yet. And it's really, most of our audience are mix engineers and producers and songwriters who are mix engineers and producers,
right? Yeah.
De facto. And it's like, man, we need to be talking to mastering guys because they're the one part of the chain that we don't really have. We need them, they're a resource we need to scale out to. So welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on and being willing to talk to us.
Awesome. Yeah.
I know Mike's used you a bunch on records, and he's been, man, we got to get Dave on. We got to get Dave on. So glad to finally see you're on.
Yeah, you have a new facility now, right, Dave? Dave's in Winston.
I'll try and keep the story really short. When I moved here about 6 years ago to North Carolina, I bought a house, and I put my stuff all in one of the bedrooms for a little while, and then looked for a building. For a minute, I was going to convert the garage, and then I decided real estate's pretty affordable. And I found a building about 2 or 3 years ago that was perfect. Got a loan and got it, and hired Thomas of Northward Acoustics to design the room. And I was going to have my final kind of dream studio. As it's turned out, it's a long story I'm not going to go into, but about a month ago, I decided not to actually build it.
Oh, no kidding.
And instead, I'm going to extensively renovate the garage.
Very cool.
So probably not do a full-on Thomas design, but have him consult and, best practices. And it kind of makes a lot more sense for me at this point. So, and I'm in the garage right now, but I did just a very low end kind of ghetto acoustical treatment, and nothing, anybody that follows me on Instagram, I post videos when I'm working on something, and you can see it's, it sounds fine and it's workable, but it's not very pretty. So
the facility is Greg McNair Mastering.
Dave
McNair. Yeah. Dave.
Oh,
McNair.
I'm sorry, Greg. Dave McNair Mastering. Sorry.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's North Carolina, near the Salem area, Winston-Salem. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Winston-Salem, North Central, kind of near the mountains. It's really beautiful here. Moved here about 6 years ago after my whole professional career being in Austin, New York, LA. Those three places kind of rotated around those places for most of my career. And you mentioned the mastering thing, but actually I was a recording engineer, mixer, producer for 20 years before I got mastering. So,
Los Lobos, right?
Los Lobos, a lot of, the Stevie Ray Vaughan was a mix thing, and fortunate enough to work with a lot of great people. And really, I enjoyed recording. I still do a little mixing from time to time, but mastering just suits my personality so much better. Once I started having kids, it's like I couldn't sit in the studio for 14 hours a day and tell people to tune their guitars and stuff. So,
I found that whenever I was working on records that I would start falling asleep during those long vocal punch days on a tape machine where you were just engineering, like where you were just doing the overdubs, the doldrums of the overdubs in the old school where you were with a tape machine. That is like, it is the most mind numbing work. And
yeah.
And
well, I went kind of in a circle, because when Pro Tools really first started to happen in the late 90s, early 2000s, it seemed like such an unrock and roll, unromantic, I don't want to, if that's what I'm going to have to do to continue to engineer, I don't really want to do it. So that's when late 90s, when I started to tip my toe in the mastering thing. Subsequently, I really got into Pro Tools, and I love working nonlinear. I even had some situations, 10, 15 years ago when I was mastering full time, but occasionally I'd get asked to mix, and we'd go in a studio and do it on a console, but it was Pro Tools, and I ended up doing as much in Pro Tools as on the console, so.
Yeah. Right. Because you always think like, oh man, I miss it until you got to go back and do it. And you're like, oh man, I miss all my new tricks that I'm sort of like, you don't realize it because you're doing them, but then you get back on an old console, like, oh, I could have done this, or you're out of the sweet spot. You're mixing the drums and the monitors are on that side of the desk on a 100 input console or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. I've got a bunch of mastering things there's all these Facebook conversations about a myriad of things. So headroom, what a mastering engineer wants to see in regards to headroom. Everyone says, oh, they want their peaks to be X, Y, or Z. They, leave 3 dB. Some guys say, I don't care. Use all the bits, go all the way to the top. What do you want to? What do you believe mastering engineers want to see from a client? What do they want to master?
Well, it doesn't matter to me. I don't really. The only thing I want is for it not to be, not to be heavily limited. Well, look, there's kind of like two groups of mixers. There's the guys that are so good that they have built their whole thing into delivering really loud, but they're almost not compromising the mix at all. Or if they do, it's been so skillfully done. And, if I get something from Serban or somebody like that, it's railed, but it sounds great. And I have literally nothing to do.
Is he limiting it before it comes to you?
Oh, it's a brick wall. It just looks like that, but it sounds amazing. And then there's the other people, the mere mortals, which are like 95% of the other people, where they may have gotten really good at getting the mix up to a competitive level, or at least a level that will get them approval for the mix. But the unlimited one, I can usually get the unlimited one louder than their reference limited mix, and I can do that and get it louder and cleaner if I start from the unlimited mix. But in terms of how far the file goes up, it's totally inconsequential because I'm going to gain it up or down to be whatever level I need it to be.
I've always felt like I was taking crazy pills and I don't want to be one of those guys that makes the mistake of actually typing something in and hitting submit, because then you get beat up for the next 4 days on Facebook.
Yeah.
But it's like, what does anyone care unless you've got an analog room that you've already got levels set to drive levels, right?
Yeah.
But whether you're at the top bit or you're halfway down, I mean, you're only going to have less resolution from a bit perspective, depending, but it's like, why not use all the real estate, right?
It doesn't make any difference from a digital sense. It will sometimes make a difference if I'm going to EQ, or process or compress or whatever, analog. The analog stuff doesn't like to have a lot of level going through it. So I recently switched my whole mastering setup around where I bypassed 2 active gain stages, which I used to turn stuff up or down. So now I'm doing it digitally, and my gear is passively chained together. So I have no level control over what's going on in the gear except at the digital level.
Right.
So I have in my workstation, instead of having a pitch and catch of 2 programs or whatever, one stereo track is the mixes, and then the other track above it is the track I'm going to record to. So it goes out of the workstation, goes into the analog stuff, and gets re-recorded. So I just digitally gain up or down in that track where all the mixes sit before it even hits any of the analog stuff. The other thing, though, I will say is that from my own experience mixing, when I mix, which is like once a year or twice a year or something, and I usually master my own mixes, which is kind of a big no-no, but I do it anyway. My waveforms are like huge grass on them, and they're like that because by the time I turn the limiter off to render the mixes to master, even if I've been super careful, it's hitting red. So I have to gain it down even more before I bounce the mix. Mm-hmm. And so when I get a mix that's maybe not limited, it still's got a lot of, grass on the thing, but it's loud as shit, it kind of leads me to believe that it might have sounded better because they're pounding their digital summing and like the more headroom you can have, even in the digital environment, the better off things will be. Your plugins won't get close to clipping.
Right. I get that.
And one plugin that's clipping is not a big deal. One few red lights on the stereo bus is not a big deal, but you add it up over, 50 tracks or 60 tracks. And if you don't have any of that, you're going to remove like 5% of grunge that you probably don't want.
All right. So to clarify, the actual file that's delivered to you, you don't care where the peaks are on that.
No.
So, because we're talking about two separate things here. We're talking about the stored level on a file that gets delivered to you to mastering.
Right.
And then we're starting to talk, which is a sister conversation about how you're controlling those peaks, which is a brick wall limiter, a transient limiter. So, okay. So Dave McNair does not mind getting files all the way to the top of the file. He'll deal with them. No problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know. In regards to the peaks in a mix, let me tell you what I do, and I'm going to get your input on this. What I'll do is I'll put an L2 on the end of my master bus, and then I just crank down that threshold until I see 1/10 of a dB, just so I know that I'm in this scope. And I may have a rogue thing that just blips, like a snare hit that hits 1/2 a dB.
Right.
But I'll go back and I'll raise my threshold 1/2 a dB.
Right.
Sometimes I'll print something. I'm not saying that there's nothing printed that isn't, but in essence, it's a volume knob. It just lets me use my full scope of it.
Right.
So I'm trying now in the new digital version of myself, in the new playlist, Spotify, YouTube algorithm world, I'm trying not to beat the living daylights out of my mixes to get loudness loud. Right. This goes on to my second conversation that I think we all need to have. In the old days, when there was a compact disc and you had a finite container to hold your music, there was a level war. When there was vinyl, there were level wars. When there were cassettes, there were level wars, right?
Yeah.
We don't have level wars anymore in this new paradigm because you give all your mixes once Dave masters them, they go out, and then Spotify, and everybody uses a different algorithm where they're not looking at the peaks, the grass that you're calling, which is a great way to describe the wavelengths. You see all those nice little peaks on them. They're not really measuring those. They're measuring the inter sausage of it, of the wave file, which would be VU or loudness or
right.
dB full.
It's a very specific European standard.
What is it? Loudness over time. What's LUF stand for?
Well, I don't remember exactly what LUF stands for. Loudness units, something or other. But
over time, full scale or something.
There's different kinds of LUFs, and if you care about the number, what you want to look at is long-term integrated or integrated. And so what it does is it's.
I want to write this down. Would you long-term integrated?
Long-term integrated or just integrated, because you don't care about the momentary LUFs. You want the average level, and it's not really VU. It's a calculation. It's a very specific calculation, and it even has a gate in it so that when things get real quiet, it ignores that.
That's a great question. I wanted to ask you about what happens when you have a Led Zeppelin song that's like acoustic for the first half, and you got a rocker in the second half.
Only the loudest parts will then be incorporated into the calculation that gives an overall average level of it.
All right, so correct me if I'm wrong here. To explain it to a layman, let's say you were listening to a record outside of someone's car, and they had you could hear the car rocking. The difference would be that if you put a couple of cars next to each other, you could match. They would be matching that level. All these playlists. But if you got in the car, you would hear all these spikes and transients on one mix where it might not have it on another.
Something like that. Yeah,
that's a good analogy. Yes.
Yeah.
So now in this new world, this is a long convoluted argument or conversation, but it gets to a really important point. As mix engineers, we were continually trying to get these levels loud to get them on CDs, so we're the loudest thing on the record because louder is better. Now we got this new system where loudness. They're just going to take that and they're going to find that level as if they were standing outside the cars, make all those levels the same so that when you open the doors, the peaks come on and it's like one guy seems louder than the other. So for a guy like me who was struggling to be loud, I was taking the peaks away. So now when they play my mix on a Spotify, I appear, because they've matched the loudness, mine is shaved off and it no longer has all the grass, all the peaks. Someone else who can keep those will apparently have more energy and will be louder, will be perceptively louder to probably the tactile sensation of listening to a mix. So this is the new challenge of our world. And that's why I'm not using brick wall limiters. I use a ton of limiters in my mixes, a ton of compression in my mixes to over time as an EQ, right? Not a sort of a EQ over time to shape and make things feel a certain way. But when I get to that 2-bus, I'm in the new version of me, the man I want to be as a mix engineer. I'm really trying to keep those peaks because I think that they're going to be a net result that I'm going to be have a competitive advantage on a streaming platform. Now, they all have different algorithms to get to their levels, but they all do the same sort of business. Tell me your thoughts on that. Is my thought process right on this, or do
I mean, my general thinking only comes from kind of my mix experience. And that is that, and I mean, I don't think it's a good idea to pay too much attention to that stuff. When I'm mixing, I don't pay any attention to any of that shit. I just make it sound as big and punchy and as good as I want it to sound. And then when I master it, I just get it as loud as anybody else's stuff. So you can get lost in all that stuff if you're thinking about it too much. For one thing, if you're going to send to any of many people that are experienced and are good mastering people, let them deal with getting it loud. If you're in the process of your mixing, if you need it to be at a healthy level to get the client approval, put the limiter on early. And like when I send stuff to clients, I mean, it's probably got 4 or 5 dB of limiting, but when I take it off, the mix is not radically changed. It hasn't I haven't obsessed about getting the most infinite snare punch or whatever with 4 or 5 dB of limiting going on. I just kind of I might turn the limiter off while I'm mixing and go, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And then turn it back on. I think that's a better strategy than either building this infinitely punchy mix with 8 dB of limiting, which will get you to a competitive level, because then the mastering person is stuck. If you send an unlimited mix, it's going to sound so radically different than that mix that you crafted with 8 or 10 dB of limiting that it's going to become hard to deal with. But maybe it's a dB or 2 shy of really where they want it to bang. Then I have to take a super limited mix and turn it up, and it just doesn't work as well. The other strategy is to just make it sound great with no limiter whatsoever, and at the very end put a limiter on it and crank it down 2 or 3 dB, and that's the safest. The problem with that is it's hard to get client approval that way. Like most mixes, if you're realistic, they're going to need 6 dB of limiting to get client approval. So,
and you're talking about limiting on the 2-bus, the final mix.
Yep.
Yeah, that seems so heavy. What are you using that you could sign off on with 6 and 8 dB of limiting? What limiters do you like?
Nothing will sound that good, with that much.
What do you like for heavy limiting?
I use about 5 or 6 different limiters, and I use different ones for different kinds of program material. Sometimes even within the same album, I'll use different limiters, and I'll have one set of tracks with one limiter and the other songs with another limiter.
Are they all digital?
Yeah, they're all digital. I'm not really into the analog limiting so much. And I don't pound the converters anymore. I haven't done that in many, many years. So my method is I put my standard limiter, which is a soft clipper that is probably the only thing I'm not going to reveal. I've been using it for years, and very few people use it or know about it. And I put my standard soft clipper that I'm going to start with on every session, a template, and it has 10 dB of gain. So I'm listening through 10 dB of soft clipping. So I then set all my gains of the analog stuff and the pitch going through the D to A and back to the A to D after the analog stuff. So there's like 5 or 6 dB of headroom on the A to D. And even when it's recorded, you know, in the workstation, there's 5 dB before it hits 0 because I'm gaining it up 10 dB. So it means that I can turn, when I need to revise it and turn something up or down, and it's not so much an EQ thing, it's a level thing, I can go up or down without any, you know, the limiter just sits at the same level, and it's actually like 8.7 dB of gain. But I mean, that doesn't help for the mix in a mix tip sense. That's more of a specific mastering thing. But the point being that even when I process whatever I'm going to do for the master, I don't pound the converter, and I always have a fixed amount of gain in the limiter. And if that limiter can't deal with it, I'll modify the processing a little bit. Like maybe I'll use some compression just on the low band, especially if it's, you know, hip hop or something. And a lot of times on urban or hip hop stuff or stuff that's not dense, a lot of space, but it's got huge low end, you can't really use the soft clip. So then I use a more traditional brick wall limiter, and that would either be DMG Limitless or FabFilter Pro L.
So when you talk about clipping the converters, you're talking about the capture compressor.
That was the old. Some people still do it that way.
Yeah.
I did it years and years ago. I did it that way.
The idea was the error correction would be the fastest limiter in the world, or what?
The idea is that there wasn't a lot of soft clippers. There was just software brick wall. And a soft clipper it just will kind of rewrite the very top of the waveform and kind of curve it. Whereas brick wall limiters will rewrite the top of the waveform to just absolutely stop everything. And the perceived difference is that the brick wall limiters will have perceptibly less distortion, and you can also see it on a scope, but they have way less punch. The soft clippers have almost the exact same amount of punch that the unlimited mix have, but they trade that punch and level for distortion. So every project I have to kind of decide, I want to keep all this punch, is this distortion acceptable? And if I go, no, I can hear it too much, it's just too gritty, then I have to try one of the more brick wall oriented limiters as opposed to the soft clip. But the way, before any of the software was available, you used to just use essentially the soft clip or the hard clip that happens if you just pound the input of the A to D. And some converters will have a subtle amount of compression at the very top that's due to the analog input kind of saturating just a little bit. And the weird thing I found years ago is on prisms, which is what I use, they will start to compress before 0. You get up to like -2 and they start to compress.
And that's not a function of a setting. That's just
what they do. And so I want tons of headroom on the A to D when I'm recording it back into the session after my EQ and stuff.
And then you make up your final level in that.
Correct. But I'm listening through it gained up crazy, so I know exactly what it's going to do.
So you've got a file coming out of a digital audio workstation. You're doing some clipping in there on that converter.
I'm not doing any clipping at the source.
Okay. So where are you doing this like 10 dB of soft clip?
I'm listening on input to the record channel of my workstation.
So you go into the analog world, then go back into the digital world with a lot of headroom, and then you go ahead and get your final level on that recaptured file.
But all that simultaneously. I'm listening to it gained up at, the meters are pounding, but the waveform that's captured has got 5 dB of headroom to go to 0.
Got it. And you've stayed in the analog world. Do most of your records, do you do records that are all digital?
Yeah, I probably work all digital about 30 of the time. That's if you get one of those, Serban kind of things, or there's a guy in Nashville I do a lot of work with, Sean Moffat. His stuff is always super loud, but very skillfully done. And
Great mixing.
and I just don't, it doesn't need to be gained up anymore. And it needs so little or no EQ that I don't even want the footprint. I don't want the box tone of going through an EQ,
Mm-hmm. And is that what is out in the analog world for you, EQ, or are you hitting compressors out there too?
I'm using, actually these days I'm using more software compressors than analog. And I have some great analog compressors, but for some reason I really like the software compressors a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I either will put those on the source file before it goes out to the analog stuff, or I'll go, okay, this is doing something that I'm probably going to like. I'm going to put it virtually in the same plug-in rack as the soft clipper, before the soft clipper, and I'll monitor through it as I record it. And then I'll copy that setting and put on that one track.
Will you, I'm still not understanding, the soft clipper lives where?
On the track where the individual tunes get recorded to.
Okay, so it's the input of the DAW, but you're clipping it, but you're well below the input. You're not saturating the input of that captured file, but the first plugin is like this soft.
Put it this way: if you crank down your L2 to 8 dB,
yeah,
and you mixed and you just lit a few lights, when you turned off that L2, you'd have 5 or 6 dB of headroom on the digital bus. So I'm getting all the level I need from the 8 or 10 dB of limiter or soft clip, and whether it's a limiter or soft clipper, I'm setting the same amount of gain.
This is in the digital world, though.
In the digital world.
Okay, this is a really interesting concept too. We were talking to Reed Shippen last week about sequence of gear. It's like, do I want this compressor you were talking? I thought it was interesting we were talking about. Right. Sometimes I'll put that on the source file and compress the source file, go out to the analog world, do some business out there, come back in. And it's like, oh, you know what? I'm going to move that compressor before the EQ. Okay, I'm going to move that compressor after the EQ. Okay, I'm going to put a little bit before and after. Talk about that and what makes you think that way.
It's dependent almost entirely on the low end. So if I've identified a software compressor that I think I want to use on a song, which by the way is really probably only like 10% of the time. I don't use that much compression. Over the years, steadily, I've used less and less, but there's a time where it does something cool. So let's say I pick this, I'm going to use this, Tone Project's Unisum, which is currently one of my favorites. I'll put it on the source file first. In other words, the un-EQ'd mix, unprocessed mix, and go, okay, that's kind of cool. It does something kind of cool. And then I'll go through the EQ and, capture it and all that. Or process of EQing it, I realize that, usually I'll intuitively know right away as soon as I hear it, as soon as I put it up, but I'll go, I really had to sculpt the low end a lot on this one. Like I had to pull 25 Hertz down, I had to pull 60 down, had to add a little bit at 80. So that low end profile, the energy of that is going to really, the compressor is going to react differently to that. So instead of putting the compressor on the un-EQ'd mix before it comes out to the analog stuff, I'll then put it post analog EQ, which will be on the same input monitoring that my overall level is. And I'll listen to it that way.
But it makes a big difference, right?
It
creatively makes a decision.
Yeah. Well, it makes the everything punchier. If anybody that mixes knows that if you need to get something really punchy, you're gonna lean out the low end going to the compressor, and then maybe add some later. But if there's too much going to the compressor, even if you have side chains and all that bullshit, it's just going to react to more density on the low end and compress it just gets much punchier if you make the low end lean to the compressor, and then make up the low end on the other side of that.
Do you find that the records you're putting out now are about the same level as the CD era, or are you actually saying I'm probably about 2 dB lower in apparent level?
No, I'm just as loud as ever because, you know, I did some stuff for, I can't think of the name of the band. It was Brittany Howard, not Alabama Shakes, but her other band. And, you know, I made it loud as fuck. I'm talking like -8 or -8.2 or something. And the label guys are like, it sounds great, but we just heard it on Spotify and it's not loud enough. I'm like, I mean, even with the volume matching and stuff. And it turns out that I went, okay. And I just like turned it up 2 dB and sent it to them and they loved it. But it turns out that gain replay thing, you know, the auto match deal, I don't think it works on the browser version of Spotify. I don't think you can engage that on the browser version of Spotify. I think it's only the app version.
Oh, wow.
Crazy.
So it's people, you know, near the top of the mastering food chain, they are not delivering some quiet thing for streaming. That is not happening at all. So I did some tests a while back where I took like 3 or 4 versions of the same tune and just put up to YouTube, you know, and called it the Barking Pumpkins, like nobody's gonna. And the loud one actually sounded better. Even like we waited for the volume normalization to kick in. And it's not a hard and fast rule that the louder it is, the worse it's going to sound after a streaming service does their stuff to it. It just doesn't work that way. So it still is very valid for the clients to want it super loud, even in an era of streaming.
Yeah. We were also talking with the guys, a couple of guys, Jeff Giuliano and Reed, where they're saying it's a struggle as a mix engineer because the rough mixes are so whacked out. That's kind of like, you can never be lower than the rough mix. And if the rough mix just has a blast in, well, then the rest of the chain has to compete with it.
Yeah.
Even if that never sees the light of day, it affects.
Well, and that's, you know, part of that is, and I completely understand this, you know, they're just like, we don't want to fight that fight. We don't want to be the one to tell the client that, no, trust me, it's going to be better. You just got to live with, you know, instead of saying, you know what, turn your fucking rough down 2 dB to compare to my mix. Yeah. You hired me, you're paying me a lot of money. Why don't you do some due diligence to figure this shit out? I've had like label guys call me like, why does it have to be so loud? I say, because the refs that they get from the producers are stupid loud and distorted and fucked up, but everybody's grown to like that. So now they have to make it. And this is like the head of the label. He goes, oh, that's a shame. It's like that. I'm like,
yeah,
it's just the whole thing's fucked up. It's the blind leading the blind. I would never ask, you know, Reed, who I know well, or any of these other guys to go, oh, you got to tell your clients that it'll get as loud as they want later on in mastering, but it's going to tie your hands to have to, you know, grind it at this point. My clients, I only have a handful of mixed clients now because I don't go out and, you know, I'm just not interested in doing that anymore. They don't give a fuck how loud I deliver the mix. They never say, well, this mix at this point is not as loud as the previous album you did. They never say that because they just totally trust me because I've been doing 100 out, you know, done 100
yeah.
out. So I don't fortunately have that constraint of having to, you know, do some stupid loud level because the artists are not smart enough to realize that it doesn't have to be like that, you know, until the very end.
It's a good point. You know, I can remember in New York sitting on some mastering session, and they were talking about, it might've been Vlado, and they were talking about Streisand listening to a reference in a convertible and having issues. And they're like, don't listen to it in a convertible. All the high end gets blown around by the wind. It's like,
there's no low end.
These conversations that we have with clients sometimes are maddening. You know, when you're talking about things like why it doesn't have, no one likes the rough mix, by the way. They just think that there's some magical memory location in their brain with the rough mix that now your mix isn't as exciting because it's down 4 decibels, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's been that way since Led Zeppelin, trying to get vinyl hotter. It's all that.
I like it loud too. Everybody likes it loud. I love to, get it blazing and see how far I can go without, and have it still sound good. But the mix stage is not the place to do that.
Yeah.
You can do it, but you could potentially, you're going to sacrifice a lot on down the road.
Well, you have this thing about you that all mix engineers, mastering engineers, and some producers have, which is like, I'm not going to say you've given up. You don't attempt to change people's process. You just make it great.
I used to a long time ago. And
where you were saying like, hey, do it this way. Give me this.
Yeah,
I want this, and don't do that and undo that. You just say, give it to me. And then you put out a great product.
Figure it out.
Yeah. it's because I just, it's not because I've become cynical or anything. It's just because it's a lot easier when you're not mixing. It's a lot easier as a mastering engineer. I've trained myself to be less attached, to the project creatively. And for a lot of mastering guys, it's really easy for them to say, I'm not doing anything. This is their project. I'm in service to them. And I feel like that now, but 20 years ago when I first started mastering, I'm like, no, I'm going to save you from yourself because you don't know how it works. And now I'm like, you know what? Maybe you'll do something different next time around. I'm not going to put my foot in my
But you've
mouth.
got the ability to pull stuff out of the toilet,
Yeah.
I will tell you that some of the times, because there's arguments I won't have, or there's conversations I won't have with clients that could turn into arguments. But I won't have them, but I will find that there are some happy accidents where something comes in where it's like, I would have told you not to do that. And now we got a piece of music that's really cool because of it.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I retired from producing because I got to the point where I was so trained to have, producers need to kind of have like an opinion about every little thing, but they also have to just let go of that opinion in a second if it doesn't serve the situation.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
I got to this point where, I looking back, I was incredibly dictatorial. I was hopefully nice about it, but I would always just say, no, I've tried that 20 times. It never works like that. So we're going to do it my way. Instead of going, yeah, let's try that. It didn't work the last 50 times, but maybe it'll work this time. I just got to where I didn't have the patience to do that anymore. And I had situations where, the artist would go, let my friend come in and play acoustic guitar. She's not really great, but I think she's going to add something. I'm like, and they come in and they play their amateur thing, and all of a sudden the track completely comes to life. Yeah. So I was like, you know what? This is too hard to like constantly embrace this opinion about everything, but let it go all the time.
I've secretly admired mastering engineers over the years because it's every day, essentially, you're completing a record.
Well, that's the best part of the job. The feeling of like, okay, next.
It must be what those guys at RCA Studio B felt like after doing mono Elvis records, and they cut 16 songs in an afternoon. What a sense of accomplishment.
Oh,
you're onto it where I'm stuck in like, I don't even know what I'm listening to anymore because I've heard it so many times, right?
And the other thing too is that I could deal with engineering, most of the stuff I did, I would kind of wear all the hats. There was some producers I worked with a lot that I would record and mix. And there's a lot of stuff where I'd mix only, somebody hired me. But most of my old situations were kind of carrying it from the beginning to the end. And my ADHD is so bad, man, like a month into it, I'd be like, I can't even fucking want to hear these songs anymore. It's just much less spent all day long doing overdubs. Yeah. So, but now it perfectly fits my ADHD because in a typical project day, I might work on 5 projects, 3 songs, some gnarly metal thing, then a reggaeton, couple of songs, then some Americana singer-songwriter. And, it feeds exactly how my personality is.
Do you ever call the client back and just say, hey, man, this mix just isn't happening, or you got way too much low end that I can't pull out? I know Kaplan is a mutual friend of ours.
Yeah.
Credits you greatly on having given him tips over the years of like, hey, you know, I know you probably asked for it in your friendship with him, but do you get stuff where you're just like, guys, I can't make this sound like you want it to sound like?
Well, I don't put it in those terms, but there's the people that I've ended up working with for a long time. We've usually kind of got to the thing where, you know, through a long process, you know, they've really, you know, maybe got their monitors more together, their room, or their sense of what they want to do. And there's very little to say at that point. But there's people that maybe I've just worked with for a few years and they're really intuitively great. They're talented. They have some, you know, a natural gift for it, but they're not as far, you know, on down the road as a Kaplan or a, you know, Sean Moffat or one of those guys. And sometimes, I mean, low end is actually pretty easy to deal with. It's really easy to cut too much and still have the integrity of the mix great. But sometimes I'll get something and call them and say, you know, I mean, it's tough because I don't ever feel like making an artistic determination, but once in a while, you know, I'll say reprint mix 3 out of those 10 and just, you know, give the bass a little more 50 hertz because it's really perfect the way it is now, but it could just have a, you know, or like, you know, give me the vocal up. I don't print vocal ups for everything, but on that one song, give me a dB up or something on the vocal. But that's about as much as I get. And honestly, I have a lot of clients, you know, I have a full-time project person that handles all the interface, so that I can just live in my solitude, my fortress of solitude. But I get a lot of requests through those, and it's really tough because she generally will say Dave's blanket policy is to not make proclamations on, you know, whatever. And that's because I get a fair amount of stuff where the mix is pretty good. The relationships of things are pretty good. You know, kind of the taste calls and stuff are good, but they haven't been doing it long enough. And there's just too many little things. And I can't write them or have an hour conversation and say, you want me to give an opinion about what could make the mix better? Another 10,000 hours of you mixing will make the mix better. And that's all I can tell you. Yeah. You know, I can list point by point. You need to round off the transients. You need to put some saturation on this thing. You don't need the things that mono, you know, try it with less reverb the next time, but I don't have time to do that. So,
yeah. Is your mission statement, and it probably changes, but like there's guys that they don't want to be heard. They want to make it better. Or are you afraid to drag something like Bizarro World different than what the mix engineer sent you? You know, what's your policy on?
Well, I think back to when I would send all my stuff off to mastering, and I didn't have a sense of like the A-list guys being these, you know, unapproachable like gurus or whatever. Like, you know, I'd have Doug Sachs at the mastering lab do something, or Ted at Sterling do something, and I'd get the ref and I'd call him back. I'd say, you know, it's great, but the whole thing needs to be brighter. Or it's great, but you know, I need a lot more bass on like those. And they go, okay, you know, or I call back and say, no compression. I don't want you to compress my mix. I don't care if it will play better in a variety of systems. I designed it to have exactly that amount of compression. So as a mastering guy, I'm very respectful of what the work that's gone in to get it to that point. And I just don't feel like I want to change it artistically.
Yeah.
That being said, the most fun things are to get something that sounds pretty good. You know, like they've been at it for 5,000 hours and the relationships are good. The tones are good, but their monitors are really off. It's dark. It's got way too much low end, you know, and I think nothing about fucking 8 dB at 10K. Like, we need to make this sound normal. And it's not like My Way or the Highway or like everything must be bright. It's like, this is what it would sound like if you were mixing on some ATCs instead of broken speakers with no tweeter, with a tweeter that's incredibly bright,
Right.
So I have no problem, but I don't do that because I think that their mix should be real different. I'm just going to recreate a situation that if they had their current skills, but we're mixing in like a really mission critical room, that's what it would have sounded like.
Yeah. Good point. And do you mess around with middle side?
All the time. In fact, about 100% of the time.
Interesting.
Yeah. My EQs are permanently in mid side. So, I mean, I can.
There's a real potential there to take something,
well,
to go too far with something like that if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah,
obviously.
But, not really, because this is another thing kind of born out of just like mixing. The first thing I hear when I put anything up, regardless of the style, unless it's jazz or instrumental or something, is I'm immediately focusing on the tone of the vocal. So the very first thing I do is I'm EQing the vocal just like I was mixing. And there's nothing better for that than the mid thing. So a lot of stuff, I may have nothing going on the sides, but I'm pulling out 500 hertz.
Great point.
2 dB in the middle.
Right.
I'm giving it a little presence, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And, maybe they're the low end on their low synth is, fucking 30 hertz. It's just like this, but the percussion and the toms on the side are fine. So I can just yank out 20 hertz in the middle. And so it can be the least disruptive to the integrity of the mix if you EQ an MX.
I guess you're right. If you have the wherewithal to be able to see it for what it is. Because, there is that part of everyone's career where they spend it like, I got all this stuff. I'm just going to like mess around with it. Right. And that only leads to bad destinations until you do the 10,000 hours. You start to understand what that is. But, the tools in the right hand, creates Michelangelo. I mean.
Yeah. It's I mean, people will say this constantly, and it really is, I think, a truism, is that a lot of times the experience just allows you to have a very solid feeling of what not to do, or to do virtually nothing. And I might, sometimes the project manager will say, how much time should I allot to this? You heard him last night. And I'd be like, well, the mixes sound amazing, but it still might take me 4 or 5 hours, because a lot of times I'll spend half an hour on a tune to try everything I can to squeeze a little more out of it and go, no, there's nothing.
It was better the first
hour,
first 15 minutes. Yeah, we've done that with mixes where you go back and book a room and spend a whole day on a SSL or an EVR, and you find that the original upper fader mix from the original night had something that you can't never get back.
Oh yeah. No, that's I mean, a long time ago, I kind of learned that lesson. And so what I always used to do, I was never one of those that were like, okay, just render the mix as an MP3, render the rough as, like, I made sure we rolled tape on every rough mix back in those days. Like, no, align the 1/2 inch, set it up for 30. And we're making roughs today, but we're not going to just go to the DAT. We're going to go to 30 IPS 1/2 inch, because I know I'm going to schedule to mix this for real a month from now, but we might get lucky, and I don't want it to be on a compromised format.
Stellar. Yeah, that's stellar. I want to ask you 2 things. I know you got to get going and we're running late here, but I want to know what your analog EQ is. What are you using for an analog EQ?
Well, I've got 3 different ones. I have an old Sontec, a 430B, which is the original version. There's the 430B and the 432, and then there's the current ones that if you can corral Burgess and get him to make one, he still officially makes them. But I really like the 430B series the best. It was the one that had a epoxy, it had an encapsulated op amp. And I've had it very extensively modded over the years by my friend Chris Muth. It's stock, but it's had a lot of stuff done to it. So that's kind of what I use on, if I'm going to use any EQ at all, that's usually that. Then I have an EQ built by a guy in Europe, which is a copy, which is his version of the famously available John Porter Net EQ, which is kind of like an open source schematic. And John Porter, I think, was the English guy that designed the EQs and the Trident A range, and he made that circuit available. And so a lot of people have taken his schematic and built their own versions of his. And it's very simple. It's a 4-band EQ, and it's very clean. It has almost no sonic imprint whatsoever. So I don't use it by itself, but I use it if I need 1 or 2 more bands in the Soundtech. So, because it's just invisible. Because the Soundtech has a tiny little bit of flavor, even though it's pretty transparent, but it only has 3 mid bands and a high and low shelf. And a lot of times I might need 1 or 2 more bands. So I use and it's made by a guy, his company is Golly, G-O-L-Y. It's on the internet. And it's also very affordable for anybody out there who's like just starting your kind of mastering thing. I would get that as my first EQ because it's really great for the price. Then I have a Dangerous Music Bax, which is a very broad low and high. I use that a lot. And that's it for EQ. I have some other EQs that are taken out of the rack.
That's primarily what you're sending out to the analog world to do is EQ.
Yeah. And I mean, I have some compressors. I have a API 2500, which I actually used the other day for the first time in a long time. I've got an API 2500 for compression, and then I have a pair of these kind of Fairchild-like things made by this guy in Chicago. The company is called Electronaut, and he makes a compressor called an M97, which is his version of a Fairchild. I've got those. Those are really cool. I use those too. But I really lately for compression, I've been using that Tone Project's Unisum, which is amazing. And I use a software compressor made by a German company called CubeTech. But these are like PC only, mastering specific. I mean, it's not the kind of thing most mix guys would look for.
All right, I've got one more question for you. You may or may not have an opinion about this. So I was reading an article about intersample clipping.
Mm-hmm.
So, like for instance, you have a WAV file that has peaks up to 0. And you're fine. But once you print an MP3 or convert that into an MP3, something happens with the variable bit rate and the way it's going to quantize. You're going to end up generating some distortion in the MP3 that does not exist in the WAV file.
Right. Yeah.
I've been told that you can bring it down 0.3. I like your tail. 0.3 of a dB, and that will be enough headroom. Is that true? What's your thoughts on this?
Let me just kind of break that apart because you bring up an important point and one that I forgot when you asked about the delivery, the mixed delivery. Let me just backtrack really quickly on the mixed delivery thing. I don't care how loud it is, except for one thing, and this is very important. You should always set the output of your stereo bus post limiter at minus 0.3 dB, because I get stuff all the time that I want to do virtually nothing to, that sounds amazing, but it goes right to 0. And I routinely deliver the final thing after everything is totally done, minus 0.1, minus 0.2, maybe minus 0.3 sometimes. And the reason for that is this. Let's say I get a 2448 or a 3248 mix that is perfectly crafted. It's been limited master level skillfulness. Sounds great. I want to do nothing to it. Okay. I put it in my workstation, and of course they're going to need 1644.1. The minute I sample rate convert it, the level goes up 0.3 dB, sometimes more. So, and if they compare I haven't done anything to it, but sample rate converted it and brought it down a few tenths of a dB, it won't sound that quieter, but they won't think it sounds as good because 0.3 dB is enough for you to not recognize volume, but go, the one they just did is just not as rich. Something is not. So please render your final mixes with a headroom of 0.3 dB.
Are you allowed to do that? Let's say if I were using the L2 and just using it to blip a tenth of it, just so that I know that I'm.
And by the way, the L2 limits more than the gain reduction indicates.
Okay. Yes. Good to know. And it ruins the snare drum for me. Like it It
Well, it
really
has a
takes
sound. I
too
mean, it's got its place, but recognize that 1 dB of limiting showing up on the L2 is about 3 in reality.
So whenever you watch the L2, do you know the little digital readout of what is that accurate?
Is that like the volume readout?
Like there's a little showing. Let's say you had this much minus your most peak reduced moment was minus, and it keeps a record down here.
So it keeps a record of the loudest final output level.
The loudest amount of gain reduction.
Oh,
I'm wondering if that's accurate.
It might be.
But here's my question to you. If I were to set my output at -3 on that, is that okay?
Minus 0.3.
Yeah, minus 0.3, 0.3 of a dB.
Yeah.
Is that okay, or do I need to actually do it to the master fader in the session?
You could do it at the L2. It should cross-reference. It should totally cross, because that's not enough so that you're going to give up much in the terms of the client approval and the volume war, but it's enough so that if you get lucky and the mastering person wants to do virtually nothing, that the sample rate converted one will be at the same level once it's been made louder by the sample rate converter and then brought down to not,
So you're saying that 0.3 minus 0.3 of a dB is enough to generate any files that live downstream, MP3, sample rate converted files. So when
MP3 is a little trickier. It depends. It's too long a discussion to go into, but that's a different thing, and that's where you order you don't need to worry about it at the mix stage, but that's where you order a master for iTunes or Apple Music or whatever, that kind of thing. And those, I run a real-time MP3 plugin, and I check it at 256, 320, 128. I check it with, Apple AAC, MP3, different things. And in real time, I bring the master fader down to not show clips, because it's real time making it an MP3, and it's going to show me how much level. And
wow, that's cool.
So a file that, and it's completely different for every kind of music. And whether you can hear what it's doing is a totally different discussion. But let's just say you can hear grunge from the MP3. If I'm going to deliver a 2448 or 2496K, mastered for iTunes or Apple Music or whatever file, and I've looked at real time what sample rate conversion and bit reduction and pulling all the info out to make it 256. If my master fader is sitting at minus 0.3 already, I generally have to pull it down another 0.3 or 0.4. I usually will end up at minus 0.7 or minus 0.8 to not hit red if an MP3 is made. And here's the other thing. The bit rate reduction is all different. You make a 128, the level goes through the fucking roof. You make a 320, it doesn't change that much.
Oh.
So I look at sort of a balance of worst case scenario, and 256 being the prime thing, because back in the old days of the Apple Music Store, that was their, iTunes Plus was.
So for us engineers that have to be pulling double duty as mastering engineers, because the records don't allow for a mastering budget, would you say what is its total safe catch-all would be minus 0.7 dB?
Yeah.
And generate files at minus 0.7, and then whenever they make MP4s out of MP3s.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's huge.
And also give them, even if the digital distributor, like TuneCore or CD Baby, whatever, even if they're only set up for 1644.1, generate some files at the native rate of the mix. So if the mix was 2448 or 3248 or whatever, or 88.2, whatever, generate those as well, because I did some other experiments, and Apple is right about this when they ask for the highest resolution. If I take a source file that I'm mastering, and I always master it at the same rate as the source. So the rate of the mixes is going to determine what the session is. Mm-hmm. A long time ago, I used to just make all my sessions 44.1, set the converter 44.1, and that was the sample rate converter. And I played through a different app, I had a pitch and catch set up. I'd play it, whether it was 88.2 or 96. And then I had the master session at 44.1 because I knew, well, that's it's CD. Well, I stopped doing that quite a while back for various reasons, part of which was the Apple thing and cutting vinyl and all that kind of stuff. So now I master at the native rate of the session, 48 or 88.2 or 96. So, and I've done some tests to go, back in the old days when I first started to change that, I mean, is it really going to make a difference? And I did some tests and I couldn't hear a huge difference when I compared capturing it at 44.1 or then capturing it at the native rate of 88.2 and making a 44.1. When I compared those two and level matched them, I'm like, they sound really similar. But making MP3s from the highest resolution file versus a 1640, the MP3s always sound better made from the highest resolution file.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Got it. Awesome. Well, good to know. It changes my workflow. I'm going to see if I have. So one point of clarity. So if you're going to be, I assume, because I thought TuneCore and all those guys, do they want a specific, they're asking, like, I know
some of them do not take anything above 1644.1.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now that file, when you give them the 1644.1, that one should live down 0.7 of a dB?
Well, if they're the ones, probably, but it's tricky because they're going to send that to, well, see, I don't know how much of a player Apple is anymore. Cause I don't even listen to iTunes or, in the old days, you can't send MP3 to Apple. You have to send them at least 1644.1 and knowing that higher resolution files make better MP3s, so you'd make a 1644 for your CD baby people, and then you'd send Apple, a 2488.2 for them to make. But because I don't think they're not, CD baby or TuneCore, they're not going to make MP3s. Well, maybe they do, but if they do, it would be to put on. I don't know how Spotify works. I don't know if I've never submitted to Spotify. Do they take MP3s or do they request?
I can't remember. I've done it. Mikey?
You just go through a digital distributor. I don't TuneCore. I don't even know what Spotify wants in particular.
Well, I guess what we're saying here is if someone's going to be generating downstream files, you should give them the headroom.
If you can, yeah. And you don't have to go a whole dB. Even just a half dB will generally make the MP3 sound a lot less crunchy.
I've really come to peace with it. I had so much anxiety about level in the old days, but now it's like, hey, I just want it to sound good because I was finding that I was actually graying out my mix by doing it. I was going to a dark place, not actually, but like
don't obsess over the volume. I mean, if you're going to be the person to master it later, just don't think, oh, I'm going to have a hard time making this loud later if I don't build in some loudness now. Just don't think like that. Just think, you know what? I'm just going to make this mix great. Put my L2 or my, whatever the fuck, my master.
And on the same respect, on the other side, don't go after level to make it loud to the point where it compromises your audio.
In the mix phase, don't go after level to make it loud. And then when you're mastering it, I would say the level that works across almost all platforms is somewhere between -9 and -10 integrated LUFS. So you start to get above -9 and it's going to be, for some kinds of mixes, especially if you're doing your own mastering, you haven't been doing it for 20 years, getting to 8.5 or -8, it's going to compromise it too much for that extra 1 dB. -9, 9.5, that's the sweet spot. So in other words, if you sent a -8 mix to Spotify and sent a -9 mix to Spotify and heard them both level normalized, the -9 will sound better than the -8. But a -11 won't really sound any better than -9.
Got it.
So
Sweet spot.
you might as well try to get to 9, you know.
And if you don't know what we're talking about here, you start looking into the Lufs scale and find a Lufs meter, and you'll start to see what this is. It's a very slow molasses-looking averaging meter of your general loudness of your mix. No, we're not
Fab
talking about the
filter.
peaks. This same file will have peaks way up at the top. We're talking
Yeah.
about the loudness, the Lufs
Fab
scale.
Filter Pro L has a built-in Lufs meter. I think that's good, and you can set it to short-term, long-term.
Yeah,
you know.
Waves has a great Lufs meter too. Very useful.
But yeah, if you're like a Fab Filter Pro L user, I mean, it's right there in the meter. It's
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dave. Let's talk about how people can get to work with you. Is it as easy as reaching out to you on your website?
Yeah, you just go to my website, davemcnairmastering.com. There's a email for my project person, Danielle. I think her phone number's on there too. I don't do a whole lot of promotion stuff anymore. I used to be really, really, I don't know if I'd say aggressive, but I used to be really ambitious. And now that I'm old, I'm just not that ambitious anymore. But, so yeah, you can either go to davemcnairmastering.com or, I really enjoy my Instagram page, which is, you can either search my name on Instagram, or my handle on Instagram is McSnare, McSnare. And it started out as just a business page, but I mean, I post some personal stuff in there too. But usually a couple of 3 times a week, I do little 60-second videos of a song of some project I'm working on. And I usually show like what gear was used, and I'll put hashtags for what stuff I used. So
Yeah, your Instagram page is great. Well, it's really good.
Well, we'll put all that down in the description. This will air as a YouTube video. So if
Okay.
you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and like and subscribe. You can look down in the description to find more about how to contact Dave, and see his social pages, and maybe have him do a record for you. It also goes out on all the streaming platforms, the iTunes and the Spotifys of the world. All the
I need
audio.
I need to go to my podcast subscription and put you guys on it so I don't miss any episodes. So.
Well, thank you for being on. We're wiser for it.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Thanks.
A lot of these questions we can't get straight answers to a lot of the times because we're just asking other knuckleheads like ourselves.
Well, I mean, they may know, but they don't want to put themselves in a position to seem too authoritative, to like my way or the highway. And I'm just like old and I don't care anymore. So,
well, I think that, tons of good information that helps me structure the way I think about my mixes now as a mix engineer.
Yeah.
And also that little bit of that 0.3 to 0.7 of a dB bit, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. You need to be knowing this because everybody's making MP3s of your records. So
I would say one more thing just in closing, and that is that if I learned there was a gray area the first 5 or 6 years that I switched into mastering, where I was still doing a fair amount of mixing. I wasn't going after any new work, but there was still some stuff coming in. And I found that my mixing got way better after I started mastering because I had to kind of train myself to listen in a whole different way. And for any of you guys out there or girls that are in your mixing, walking your mixing path, even if you have a budget to send it to somebody else, try doing your own mastering and listening, because it will cause you to listen in a very different way. And one of the things that I never did much in my mixing career was I was listening to the relationships of individual things, and I was listening to the tonality of individual things. But now when I mix, I listen to the tonality of the whole thing. So if the whole thing is skewing a little bit darker than I think it should be, I'll just go through a bunch of tracks and just give everybody a little tiny bit more 5 or 6K. Or it really draws my attention, not to the sound of the bass drum or the sound of the bass, but how much of that is there in relation to the whole rest of the, And once you have your mix spectrally balanced, so the energy distribution is pretty even, those mixes will go super loud without sounding bad. It's when you have a skewed distribution of frequency that even though the mix maybe kind of sounds good, but you just didn't realize there's a bunch of 300 on this stuff that that's standing in the way.
That's a great point.
That blows up the limiter the instant you get,
That's a great point. Apparent level on like, if you look at something on a meter, 100 hertz at 0 versus 1K at 0, you would think 1K was 10 billion times louder. So there is level is apparent.
You don't want it to be a straight line, and it's nothing you can see in an analyzer. I'm just saying, let your brain, your human software, kind of scan for distribution of energy of frequencies.
But what I'm saying is, if you focus all your energy down at 100 hertz, your mix is totally based off of it. It's going to be tough to get that mix loud without changing the mix.
Hip-hop,
because your brain doesn't hear 100 hertz like it hears 1K.
Hip hop is really hard to get loud. I use an entirely different skill set if I work.
That's a great point, dude. Massive point right there.
Yeah.
Great point. Well, thank you for being on with us.
Thanks for having me. Shim, good to see you. Joe, nice to meet you. And
Dave.
One of these days, I usually try to come to Nashville a couple times a year. I'm only 6 hours away, but with COVID, it's really not a good time to travel. But when things get a little more back to normal, next time I'm in Nashville, I'll hit you guys up.
We'd love to host you.
Yeah, we'll have a coffee or something.
So well, thank you for coming on and being such a good dude and all the information.
Man. Yeah, I appreciate it.
That's it this week for the West Barn. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.